Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Dave Yoho. He's a World War II veteran who served in the U.S. Maritime Service. And, sir, thank you very much for being with us.
Oh, I appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, we'll start where we always start. Where were you born and raised, sir?
I was born in Philadelphia, August 19th, 1928, which incidentally did not make me qualified to go in World War II when I did.
Let's get right to that. So you were 13 when Pearl Harbor was attacked by the
Correct,
Japanese.
yeah.
How did you hear about it?
Well, in those days, what happened, the newspapers used to shout the headlines. So we found out about it. I lived in Philadelphia, street couriers selling the newspaper shouted, Pearl Harbor attack. We didn't even know where that was. That's how we found out about it.
And how soon did you want to join?
Well, I was 13 at that time. By the time I was about 15, I hung out with an older crowd. They were 17 and 18 years of age. And they were going. They were either going to be drafted or they went into the Navy or Coast Guard or something else. So they could volunteer and get the service they wanted. So they were older. They were going. I wanted to go too. Falsified my birth certificate, went down and enlisted in the U.S. Navy, and they caught it. They caught this deception in my birth certificate. So there I was 15 years of age. Hadn't notified my parents that that's what I was doing. So, but they soon found out because the police show up and said, do you know that your son and what have you. So I was determined to go away, and about 4 blocks from the U.S. Naval recruiting station was something called the U.S. Maritime Service. Incidentally, started in 1938 by President Roosevelt, anticipating war. They were going to have ships. They had to have these ships manned. But to me, I didn't know anything about it. I was in the U.S. Maritime Service. Uniform looked like a lot like the U.S. Navy, dressed almost similar. And I thought the girls would like it. Right? So 15-year-old, you don't think like a corporate adult. And so I enlisted. I was sent to U.S. Maritime Service training in Sheepshead Bay, New York. And it was sometime during 1944. I don't know, but in that period of time, I was one of 250,000 recruited for the U.S. Maritime Service. And then you go there and you find out they're going to put you on a merchant ship. I'm not saying they didn't divulge that, but it was never apparent. I didn't even know what a merchant ship was.
So what did the training consist of?
Well, the basic training is anywhere from 8 to 10 weeks, depending. If you're, and there were 250,000 recruited over a period of about 4 or 5 years. It started pre-war. So they train you to be attendant in some part of the ship. I elected for the Black Gang, which is the engineer crew. For what reason, I can't even tell you. It sounded exciting that you're on the ship, you're in the and I'd never even been on a ship. So they put you through basic training. And incidentally, one of the fantastic things that happened, one of the newscasters brought an entire camera crew there, and they produced a recruiting bulletin, a recruiting poster for this U.S. Maritime Service, and I was on the cover, along with 5 or 6 other guys, but I'm dominant on the cover of that magazine. So then when you're there, you find out what it's all about. Pretty rigid training. It's a military effect. You get up at the reveille at 6 o'clock in the morning. You eat restricted meals. You go where you're told to go, do what you're told to do, and all, they whip you in line. When you emerge from that, you go to a center where you are given a ship. You're assigned to a ship, and you have little or no control. So that was in New York, and the ship I was assigned to happened to be in Philadelphia. So we took a train. I went to Philadelphia to catch my ship. And it turns out the ship, the dominant part of my life, my military life was spent on there, was something called a fleet oiler, or a T2, Type 2, meaning turbine, Type 2 turbine. And this was a ship developed for World War II. And it carried fuel. And it could have carried other things, I'm sure, but they're big tanks this thing is a tank in the ground. And it is virtually like a gas station at sea. We can refuel other ships from this ship. We can also pick up oil and take it somewhere and have it put into action. All exciting. The ship was, as I say, in Philadelphia, did something called a shakedown cruise, took us up to Nova Scotia, And then when we came down from Nova Scotia, we stopped in Philadelphia again, and then they put on a gun crew. They put on a gun. We didn't have one before. They put this gun crew on there. They're U.S. Navy, and they were called Armed Guard. And they were on the ship, and we left from a port in Philadelphia, went down the coast. We went to Venezuela to pick up crude oil, dropped the crude oil off in the Netherlands, West Indies, a place called Curacao, where they refined the oil. So we dropped the crude oil off there, and they would turn it into refined oil. But at the meantime, we just moved to take on refined oil, went through the Panama Canal, and came out in the Pacific Ocean. And we were in a war zone from the time we left Philadelphia. What many people aren't aware of, we lost 300 ships off the eastern coast of the United States in American waters. Never highly publicized. Don't want the public getting upset that they were that close, but the German U-boat packs were out there. And they could see at night because the cities along the line weren't darkened, and they could actually see these ships. And if you peruse this history, if you go and see the history, it's a horrible loss of life and shipping and human suffering right off our coast. Very little discussed.
I know you've spent time in more recent years talking about the PQ-17 convoy. Is that what you're talking about?
No, that was a PQ-17 was a specific convoy that went to a place called Murmansk, Russia. Russia was the third, one of our allies, but the third dominant figure. There was the UK, the United States, and Russia. And they had nothing but manpower. They didn't have any goods or services. So the ships left, and if you look on a map, Murmansk or Arkhangelsk, the part of Russia, is very near the Scandinavian peninsula. And the Germans were housed in the Scandinavian peninsula. The PQ-17 was sent to Murmansk. Very difficult for me to say what happened to those people. In PQ-17, there were 35 ships, and they were given escorts. There were 22 or 23 escorts. They were destroyers, destroyer escorts. There were tankers, and there were torpedo bombers, because the Wolfpack was over there as well. But what they were afraid of is that German submarine, the Teplitz, which was housed in Norway, and they were afraid this battleship was going to come out and go after these ships. So somebody in that part of the ocean, it was covered by the British Admiralty. So they made a decision no longer to defend or protect those ships, but instead to go and look for the Teplitz. So they all left. And when they left, these 35 ships became just targets for the submarines. 11 ships get through. The temperature of the water, 35, 40 degrees below zero. If you hit the water, 4 minutes, you're dead. The problem is that when you are in a combat area, other ships are not permitted to stop. Horrid, but fact of war. So if that ship was taken, as, remember, 11 of them got through to this place, and all the rest were sunk. Now, some of them were fortunate enough that because the ships, many of the merchant ships, including British ships, were pre-World War II made, and they didn't go much beyond 8 or 9 knots. So they had some way of getting some of these people quickly if they knew that it happened. The others were picked up by submarines and taken to prison camps. And so the loss of human life was tragic. And there's some new books coming out just on PQ-17. Now, I'm not faulting my government for this, but this is stuff that's not in your history books. You can look it up and you can find it's factual data. PQ-17 was just one of those, because then they sent more after that.
Mr. Yoho, just a couple of minutes before we need to take our first break here, how much interaction did the vessels you were serving on have with the enemy?
Well, when you go through the canal, it's a different theater now. The Atlantic theater, when you came down the Atlantic coast, that's where we lost the majority of the ships to the German Wolfpack. When you go through the canal, you're in the Pacific theater automatically. And from the canal to where our rendezvous point was, a place called Ulithi, from there it's like 23 or 24 days. We went unescorted. And whatever Japan had out there, or whatever it was at any given time, we were subject to that. Now, fortunately, we were never struck. On a tanker, if you are struck, you're so far below water that there's no chance of getting out of a ship. But we made it to the area of combat. And our ship then would refuel other ships. And we'd tie these ships tight. They would have to be hawsed together, roped together. And the ships had to be guided at the same, they don't go straight, they zigzag. And so they guided one ship refuel the other. That's what we did. And I was in combat zones. A combat zone, though, can be 200 miles. When you're at, let's say we were at the invasion of Okinawa, was only the second time the Japanese used kamikaze. But kamikaze, that's the suicide pilot, that related to anywhere within a couple 100, 300 miles. Wherever they saw a ship and they could identify it as American ship, it was a boost to them to take that sucker out. Now, there is this reality. When I got on that ship, I thought I was a hotshot in the engine room. Never thought about it, never gave it a consideration. And when we're down there, when we go through the canal and we get on the other side, they do gunnery practice. And when you're down below in the engine room, there are large ships. On the ships, they have these large funnels things. Cowls, they're called, C-O-W-L-S, and they suck in the air. And they also amplify the sound. So I'm down in the engine room, and these guns go off, and we know it's practice. But I say to an older guy, he was probably 22 or 23. Now, we're 40 feet down, and the stairwells are just 8 feet long. So you're 5 of those till you get to the top deck. So I said to him, So what happens if we take a hit now? What's the quickest way to get out? And he says, kid, if we're hit, you ain't going to get out of here. Now, that's a grabber. I don't claim any, I don't like the word hero or heroic because it doesn't, the guys that are the heroes are the ones we lost over there. There were 16 million people that went into uniform patriotically. 400,000+ of them died. Millions more injured mentally, physically, that came out of that war. There are only about 550,000 left out of those 16 million.
Dave, let's pause right there on that poignant note, and we'll be right back on Veterans Chronicles. We're back on Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos, honored to be joined in studio today by Dave Yoho, World War II veteran of the U.S. Maritime Service. And sir, we were just talking about the sacrifices of the World War II generation, the hundreds of thousands lost during the war, the 16 million who wore the uniform. You are also telling the story about the sobering moment where the older engineer told you if the ship got hit, you probably wouldn't get out. And in a profile of you that I read, you said how quickly you matured once you were on the ship, and the maturation process gets sped up a lot. How did that play out for you?
Well, first of all, 15, 16, 17-year-old boy is still 16, 17, and you want to think of those of you who have children, how they act today. They like to sleep, and you're put on rigid watch systems right away. When you're on a ship, you're on a 4 and 8. Means you're on 4 hours, you're off 8 hours. So you're always on call. And if there's general quarters, if the ship is attacked, you have to go to a station. Now, the U.S. Maritime Service doesn't exist in peacetime like it did then. You went to U.S. Maritime Service, you were put on a U.S. merchant ship. The merchant ship is chronicled as a civilian ship with civilian employees. Now, just remember that. If you look it up, and many congressmen and senators think about it that way. Now, the sobering influence is when you're in a battle zone, you don't know what's going to happen to you. Those guys never knew when they got on a ship what would happen to them or when they would get off. So you don't think about this. You're 16, 17, 18 years of age, and you believe you're invulnerable. Nothing can take you. You can do whatever. You got your girl's picture in your pocket. You got shiny teeth and a great head of hair, and you're muscular. And all of a sudden, you realize your mortality. First time a gun goes off. Now, the real pain and suffering came from the grunts, the people that were on the ground, the people that were in aircraft when a bomber goes down in the middle of the ocean and no one recovers, the guys that go in front, that do military. There's always a realization there that this is not going to be easy, and I may not come back from this. And then you got to get over that. Bing, like that. You want to mature and become a man. Now, there's a lot to that that's bad also, because you get all the habits of adulthood, you know. You get in a port and you're allowed to drink and do whatever it is you want to do on leave. I came home, I wasn't 18 years old, as yet I couldn't even buy a drink in a bar or a hotel or at a restaurant, because the drinking age in Pennsylvania was 21. So imagine this realization. I say to what I think is a mature guy, he's 23. I say, hey, if we get hit, if we get damaged, how do we get out of here? And he said, because we're standing between these boilers and the steam mechanisms, he said, if we get hit, you don't get out. Nobody ever told that to me. No one ever said you're going to be put on a merchant ship that may or may not be armed at the time. No one told you any of those things. I don't blame my government. They needed people. People said to me, didn't they know you were a kid? I think they were desperate. They needed so many people for that ship. The U.S. Maritime Service became the U.S. Merchant Marine. 250,000 recruited, 1 out of 26. The highest casualty rate of anybody serving in the war. 1 out of 26 died. How do you come to that realization where you're going to wake up one day and realize that's where you are? And you can't come home, you can't cry to mommy, you can't go when you get burned or you fall down and you get hurt. Even if you're not attacked and you're not killed, you're going to rely on yourself and those other people who are there, who are going to help you get off that ship. And it's a horrible realization. And as I said before, the guys that go in the front line, the guys, here, in the invasion of Okinawa, there were some 23,000 deaths there, including ours and the Japanese. 23,000 in one invasion. Well, in Iwo Jima, 6,300. When the war was over, when the war was completely over, the Battle of the Bulge, we lost 19,200 guys. Kids. Mostly. The older guys were 22, 23. We had a guy on our ship who was in his 30s. Everybody called him Pops. Realization. You will become a man.
When this reality hit you, as someone who had joined younger than the age of eligibility, did it make you regret your decision ever?
Well, even if you did, you're out in the middle of the ocean. You got no way to get back.
I know you can't do it. You can't do it over again. But
no, did I ever regret doing it? Yes, I did, because I wasn't really prepared for manhood. I had a truculent side to me. I did enjoy fighting and getting in brawls in places wherever we came to ports, including secured ports where other members of the uniform were. But the realization is, if you're going to survive, it's up to you to have adult pride. I mean, no one makes you brush your teeth every day or take a shower. And some guys never did, by the way. I don't mean never, but they didn't do it regularly. The hygiene could be horrible. And you recognize you're depending on other people. And you watch the other people that you're depending on, and they're not much older than you. And you figure, if we go down, what lifeboat am I going to be in? There's going to be an officer in there, a deck officer. He might be 22 years old or 20. You don't think about that. You think about getting on a ship. This is going to go from point A to point B. You don't know where it's going. And when that war ended, August 15th, 1945, August 15th, the war ended. 4 days later, I would turn 17. And I was already a man understanding what I had to do to survive.
Wow. Dave, let's pause one more time, and we'll be right back with your story on Veterans Chronicles. We are back on Veterans Chronicles. This is the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Corombos, honored to be joined today in studio by Dave Yoho, a World War II veteran of the U.S. Maritime Service. And, sir, you were explaining a little bit earlier in our conversation about what you were doing as part of the engineering crew aboard this T2 tanker. And the tanker would take crude oil to one spot, pick up refined oil in other places, and take it to one theater or another. I know you were in a number of different theaters around the world. So explain what would happen if you took refined oil way out into the Pacific. Where did you go to get your next load, and then how did the system work?
Okay. The ship, again, is a U.S. merchant ship. Mm-hmm. You're trained in the U.S. Maritime Service. You're placed on a merchant ship. Now, these merchant ships, the one I was on, was built for wartime. It was called a WET, W-E-T, War Emergency Tanker. And they have big, big areas. They go way down into the ocean. They draw about 40 feet, which means when the ship is in the water, the first 38, 39 feet is underwater, and you only show this much of the ship. And they're the tanks. They hold this oil. And crude oil is like molasses, thick as molasses. So you go pick up the crude oil in some place like Venezuela. You have to drop it off someplace where they're going to refine it for other purposes. Incidentally, that same oil had to be used in the United States. They had to get somebody to take that and bring some of the refined oil to the United States for the people who had oil in their home. That's how they heated the home. Mm-hmm. So now we're on the ship, and this ship is made for this. The hoses, the pumps, everything are made for moving that oil quickly. So we may take that oil and go through, and we go to, the first place we went to was a rendezvous in Ulysses. It's 23 days or 22 or 23 days away from the Panama Canal. Now, when you get there, there are other kinds of tank ships there. There are barges. There are barges there in the port, the secured port. So you pump into that barge, and then the smaller ships can refuel from that barge. So that's where some of it went. You refueled other ships. Now, at sea, the ships cannot stop. So when you refuel another ship, it's quite a thing if you look it up and see how it's done. The hoses from the ship, let's say it's a destroyer, and the hoses from the tanker are on booms. They look like this, and they're big flanges. And those booms have to come together and be bolted. And the way they got bolted, they sent a guy up in a bosun's chair. And he was pulled up in the air, and when the boat is swinging around, he's got to hook these two things together. And then they pump the oil from the tanker, into the other. All the while, you're moving. Now, if you go into a port that's secured, you may be pumping that oil into a third place. However, keep in mind, 23 days to get out here, and the only place we can go for refueling is back through the canal. Otherwise, they have other ships which come there, which cannot refuel the same way, and they pump into our ship. And you have no idea where you're going. Now, the ship is armed. It has in the front a 3-inch 50 gun. It has in the back a 5-inch 38. These guns are capable of firing at the ground or at air, and those were the concern about was the air. It also has 8 anti-aircraft guns on this ship. The U.S. Navy provided the gunners. They were called armed guards. But every member on that ship is giving what they call an alternate. If when GQ, General Quarters, sound, if for some reason that guy at your gun station isn't in his gun position, you are required to take that position. And later on in life, they're going to say, it was a civilian ship and you were a civilian. I said, tell me about it. Right. The airplane didn't say, we won't hit that guy because he's a civilian. But they were the chores you had to go through. Now, General Quarters happen whether you're in an attack or not. If you're in a range of where there are enemy aircraft or enemy ships, that range could be 200 miles wide, whatever it might be. You get General Quarters. And so when General Quarters sounds, you have to leave your bunk and get to your battle station, unless you're on watch, as I was, in the bowels of that ship. But when GQ sounds, it may be an attack, it may be nearby. Just as an example, when we were close to Okinawa, which was the last invasion, when we were close there, an ammunition ship was blown up, which is also a merchant ship. And what few people know, those things were loaded with bombs and TNT and just all kinds of inflammable stuff. When they got hit, goodbye. You don't need, they disappear in a cloud of black smoke. We saw one go up. Now, it wasn't nearby. You had to have glasses on to see it. But we saw it go up. And the sky got as dark as it was nighttime. And that ship was gone with all lives gone. Part of that reality sets in. Day to day, you have to perform your function. And there's no loose room here. The older guys don't make it easier on the younger guys. The newer guys don't make it easier on the older guys. The older guys don't make it easier on the newer guys. Life is tedious at best. If you're not in GQs, life is tedious because you're on your watch, and let's say it was on 4 to 8, start at 4 in the morning, get off at 8. Now you get up, you get chow. You're supposed to go get some rest or whatnot. I worked out. We had weights on the ship. We made our own. We made them out of concrete and pieces of steel and iron. We made our own weights. So I worked out with weights. Loved the box. I was on the boxing crew when I was in Sheepshead Bay. And when we were out in the Pacific on a secure island like Saipan, I boxed and fought people from other divisions of the service. So when I say to people, can they, I'm talking to my government now, can they, will they ever understand? We gave up our youth. Think of the things you did when you were 16, 18 years of age. You went to dances. You dated. You drove a car. You went to the movies with a girl. We didn't have any of that. We gave that up. We didn't know what we were giving up. We knew that you were going to sacrifice. But holidays out there is the same as any other workday. Christmas, New Year's, you're on duty, and you have your time to be on duty. I don't regret any of it. I do it all over again. I just wish my government would understand when they delay on these bills. I'm fighting now. I fight a continuous battle in my speeches for the Veterans Administration. The current president just gave us $12.5 billion. You know, when a veteran calls on a hotline, he may not be able to make it through the next 25 minutes, and he may be put on hold for longer than that. And up until recently, if he had this desire to take his life, and that was one of the great tragedies of war, post-traumatic stress, which was not even identified as that until later. And then he gets on the phone and he can't get anybody to talk to him. What do you think he does? That's why 23 take their lives every day. And when World War II ended, we had the casualties, the physical casualties, the people injured that had to have all kinds of medical help. But the one they don't measure for you is post-traumatic stress. Show me where the stats are. It wasn't identified. World War I, they called it shell shock. Now, what happened in World War II is when the war ended, we had over 1 million guys who had post-traumatic stress, and they went into hospitals. No one wanted to admit they have it, including the guy, because you got a Section 8 discharge. Not in my group, but in the general military, you got a Section 8 discharge, which meant you got through the rest of your life, you got a little pension, but you were defined as mentally unbalanced. And I think of the guys I know and the guys I interact with today, veterans, who have tinges of post-traumatic stress, depth of their head. And what do they think about it? They get night sweats. They can't get to sleep. They sleep 4 or 5 hours a day. Incidentally, that was part of it as well. When I came home, I could not sleep anymore on a regular basis. I was diagnosed with having ulcers, bleeding ulcers. 16 years old, I was diagnosed. No medical hospital took you. If you did, you paid for your services. Mine. I was excluded from the GI Bill when I got out of the service. We weren't included until 1988. I have no bitterness, no rancor. But I think of the guys who went through it. I had until I was 62 years of age and found out I was diagnosed wrong. Drinking water in a third world country gave me something called H. pylori. Look it up. Common disease today. That's what I got. I had the bleeding ulcers, post-traumatic stress, and I got malaria while I was out there. And I can't even give blood. I can't even, if my children were in trouble, I can't be the donor. They are the consequences of war. What you see when you see a veteran is a physical vehicle of those consequences. And when you shake his hand and you say, thank you for your service, look him in the eye, don't look away. His hand, just clasp his hand and let him know that you care. Because that's what they need more than anything else. When they go to these assisted living environments, it's a hell of a way to live, a hell of a way to live the rest of your life. And some of them go through that. And there are more and more stories of this kind that other people may never get to hear.
Your passion is so real and so compelling here, Dave. I know after the war you built a very successful business career for yourself. Explain in our last couple of minutes here how you got so involved in veterans issues and when that happened.
Oh, well, when I came from the war, I thought, what was I going to do? I was 16 years old, 15 when I went in, 17 when I got back, because I served some time in post-war. There was no job for me. I wanted to go back to school. No GI Bill for me. I didn't even have a high school diploma. Luckily, there was a GED. It was just formed in those days. Took a GED, and then I got my high school diploma, went to night school, and worked during the day. And fortunate, I think God directs you. It says, listen, you're put on this earth for a purpose. I'm not going to desert you. I'm going to give you something. I want you to give it back to people. And I developed a style of speaking, made over 5,000 speeches, every state in the United States and 22 foreign countries, all over the world. And I learned this technique of speaking that I use today. Listen to the timbre of my voice or the style of my speech. I don't sound like a 90-year-old guy. Almost like the freak show. I'm the freak show they bring in. We're going to bring in a 90-year-old veteran, and this is what we look like. I believe that you have to have a cause, and I never followed that cause. And then one day, they published this magazine that was published in 1944, The Recruiting Bonus, and my wife saw it on, the Facebook, and that this was being reproduced. And so when we looked at that, I said, that's me on that cover. And that's the first time I realized, and that was only 3, 4, 5 years ago, I realized that my cause should be directed to help these people in what ways I can. I speak at their conventions. I don't ask a fee, but I ask the people who are there to contribute to one of the veterans groups. And I believe that God gave me this sense. I'm not going to go away. In fact, they wanted me to help them write a letter to Congress, and I wrote a letter for Congress, and that's how I started. Hell no, we won't go away. This is part of our history. We want people to know it. And so then God gives us messengers. And I don't see myself as any particular kind of a hero. I think I am exceptionally gifted. I have a retentive mind. I can remember all these facts and figures and expostulate them in a sense and in a way that people want to listen. So I want to do it with this veterans group, whichever one. I favor the U.S. Merchant Marine because they were never recognized properly. And the people who have the advice on it and say the opinion they were civilians and don't even know the story. In 1988, they gave us the GI Bill, 43 years after the war ended. I was already in my 60s. What did I need them for? I was already wealthy, so I didn't need them. But I found ways to use the gifts I have in the environment in which I was placed. My parents never owned a home. My parents had no college education, never owned a car. I came home, I had to work and go to school. But it all pays off because this is the greatest country in the world. I don't care what they have done wrong politically. This is the greatest country in the world. I'm proud to be a veteran. I beat my chest. I don't walk around in my old uniform. I walk around in these dudes because I can afford to buy them. But I say to everybody, remember, underneath this is a veteran who needs your care, who you really have to look at sometime and say, thank you for your service, and we want to help you enjoy whatever years you have left. And I see that as my calling.
Just about a minute left here, Mr. Yoho, and we talked in the break, and you've mentioned it again here, that people just need to know more about the sacrifices that were made and what actually happened. It's kind of been distilled down to Hitler was a bad guy, we beat him. Japan attacked us, we beat them. Obviously, understanding individual stories and what the collective toll was to preserve freedom is important. But if you could summarize what you want young people and every generation to know, what would it be? Okay,
they're so adept in the world of technology. Go on YouTube, Google Saipan, Google Iwo Jima, Google the invasion, the Normandy invasion. Find out how many people died there and know the true stories. They had to put 17 merchant ships were taken there to sink to create a breakwater. Those merchant ships were loaded with TNT. If they had been hit by a shell, they would have been gone forever. So this merchant ship is there, and they sink them in that breakwater. You can find that. All you have to do is Google it, the invasion, and then talk about the breakwater. Go back to the fact that the war was over in the Battle of the Bulge. 19,200 guys died in that thing. Or Pont'Hoc and the invasion of Normandy, where these guys climbed straight up a cliff. It won't take you any more time than it takes to Google you and talk with your friends about who you're dating or what you're drinking or where you're going to dance or who your latest girlfriend or boyfriend is. Find out about this thing. It's all available and easier to get to than ever before. And there are many sources for it. And you yourself are a source. Why do you do this? To amplify these things so other people will hear it. And I ask people to look up the history of the U.S. Merchant Marine. Look up the history of the wars. Women, 1,100 women recruited to fly the bombers. Once the warplane was made, they had to fly it someplace for armament. 1,200 of those women were recruited. 39 of them died, and they weren't given recognition until a few years ago. And somebody said, what about those women? They ferried those bombers, and they did that job. Mm-hmm. So there are all kinds of contributions to the war. Go to the World War II Museum in New Orleans or the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. Don't spend 15 minutes there. Get a tour. It doesn't cost you anything to get a tour in either of these places and find out what this country is all about. We have 325 million people. Go back to World War II, 130 million people, 16 million in uniform, 440 of them died, and we left the majority of all those heroes in foreign soil or in a watery grave. And the ones that were left come home, disenchanted, highest level of alcoholism that has ever existed in our country in post-World War II, because it's self-medication for people who have post-traumatic stress and can't even understand what the heck went on in their lives, what made them this way. I really thank you for the privilege of being here and being heard, and I hope you'll invite me back again sometime.
Dave, it's been our pleasure to have you. Thank you again for your time today. Dave Yoho is a World War II veteran who served with the U.S. Maritime Service. As you heard now, he's a frequent speaker and activist in assisting veterans of all wars. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Veterans Chronicles.